When we imagine a medieval castle, towering stone walls rise in our minds, cold gray towers reaching toward a cloudy sky. Inside, narrow passageways and vaulted chambers echo with faint drafts, carrying with them the smell of smoke from the hearth, the faint dampness of stone, and the memory of long, frigid winters. For the lords, ladies, servants, and soldiers who called these fortresses home, one question was not merely about luxury, but about survival. How could they sleep through the night without freezing to death? It is easy, from the warmth of our modern beds, wrapped in soft duvets and surrounded by central heating, to forget just how brutal medieval winters could be. Temperatures dropped sharply, winds howled across open moors, and snow gathered thick upon the ramparts. Castles, built of stone, retained the cold far more readily than they held the heat. The same walls that made them strong against siege made them merciless against warmth. Yet night after night, generation after generation, people survived and even found rest in these vast, drafty halls in the earliest hours of medieval history. Sleep itself was not the same as we know it today. Rather than one long, uninterrupted stretch, people often experienced what was called segmented sleep. They would drift into slumber early in the evening, rise for an hour or two in the middle of the night to pray, tend to fires, or even talk quietly with their family, and then return to bed until dawn. This broken rhythm meant that surviving the night was not just about enduring 8 hours of icy stillness. It was about braving a cycle of waking and sleeping, of cooling and warming again and again. The first line of defense against the cold was the architecture itself. Despite their reputation for draftiness, castles were carefully designed with certain tricks. Windows were small and narrow, often covered with wooden shutters, or even stretched oiled cloth that let in light but kept out biting winds. Thick walls provided insulation, though in perfect hand. The strategic placement of hearths ensured that at least some warmth radiated into the chambers where nobles slept. Still, for most people, the real battle against the cold took place in the bed itself. Beds in castles were not the simple wooden frames we often see in modern replicas. They were grand contraptions, especially in the chambers of nobility. Great carved frames, high off the ground to avoid drafts that swept along stone floors, supported mattresses stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool. Upon these rested heavy coverings, layer upon layer of blankets, fur throws, and sometimes even thickly woven tapestries repurposed for the night. The bed was often enclosed with curtains, drawn tightly to trap body heat and create a microclimate of warmth within. For the medieval sleeper, the bed was not simply a place to rest, it was a fortress within a fortress. Yet warmth did not belong only to nobles. Servants, guards, and common folk within the castle had their own strategies. Straw pallets were spread on the ground, sometimes raised slightly on wooden platforms, sometimes laid directly on rushes that covered the floors. These humble beds were layered with woolen blankets or whatever furs could be spared. More importantly, people rarely slept alone. Families, servants, and even soldiers often crowded together for warmth, relying on the shared heat of bodies to survive the night. What we might today see as discomfort was, for them, a vital and practical necessity. The fire played a central role in sleep. In great halls, where many people slept together, vast hearths roared, their flames echoing against stone walls, sending shadows dancing across carved beams. In private chambers, smaller fireplaces were lit, tended carefully to last through the night. Embers were banked, covered with ash, to keep them smoldering until morning. The flicker of the hearth was not only a comfort but a lifeline, a steady glow in the darkness that promised survival until the dawn, and beyond fire and bedding. Clothing itself was armor against the night. Medieval sleepers rarely stripped, as modern people do. Instead, they wore long shifts of wool or linen, cloaks draped over shoulders, and caps pulled tight against the head. It was believed that much heat escaped from the head, so the nightcap, an object often ridiculed in later centuries, was in fact a practical tool of survival. Gloves, stockings, and even boots might remain on, especially for those who slept far from the warmth of a hearth. So imagine the sound of a castle at night. The wind outside pressing against shutters, the faint drip of water seeping through stone, the crackling of logs in the fire, a servant stirring embers, careful not to wake the household. In the noble chambers, heavy curtains drawn, muffling the sounds of the night. In the barracks, the slow breathing of men sleeping shoulder to shoulder. In the kitchens, scullions curled by the hearth, seeking the last of its warmth. Each sleeper, wrapped in wool and fur, fought their private battle against the cold, yet together they formed a picture of survival, of adaptation, of quiet resilience in a world where comfort was never guaranteed. This, then, is where our journey begins. In the chill of stone castles, in the flicker of firelight, in the weight of blankets and the closeness of family, we discover how people of the medieval world managed to sleep, not merely as a luxury, but as a triumph of. As the night deepened in a medieval castle, the struggle against cold became an ongoing ritual, a rhythm that tied together architecture, routine, and custom. Each layer of stone, each chamber design, each choice of fabric and firewood had its role to play in keeping human beings alive through the long, dark hours. To understand how they managed to rest, we must wander deeper into the winding corridors of the medieval fortress, peering into rooms both grand and humble, each holding its own secrets of warmth in the chambers of the nobility. Sleep was a performance of wealth and practicality combined. The lord or lady of the castle would often retire to a bedchamber that was more than just a place to rest. It was a statement of power. Yet, even in these rooms, where the walls might be draped in tapestries depicting biblical stories or hunting scenes, the cold of stone was always near at hand. To combat this, people layered fabrics not only upon their beds but upon their walls. Heavy woven hangings were not mere decorations. They served as insulation, breaking the draft and offering a soft barrier against the winter air. The room itself became an extension of the bed, wrapped in a cocoon of fabric, dim, quiet, and a little less cold. The bed itself was almost a world of its own. Curtains hung thickly around its frame, shutting out the drafts that crept even through well-sealed shutters. Once the curtains were drawn, the space inside would grow noticeably warmer, filled with the combined breath and body heat of those who lay within. These beds were often shared not only by married couples, but sometimes by children, relatives, or close attendants. Warmth was communal. Privacy, as we think of it today, was far less important than survival. Down in the great hall, where retainers and guests slept, the arrangements were simpler, but the principle remained the same. Straw mattresses were spread out near the hearth, bodies clustered close, cloaks drawn tightly. Here one could hear the crackling of logs and feel the glow of the embers throughout the night. For those who drifted in and out of sleep, the fire was both lullaby and guardian. Someone always had the task of tending it, ensuring that it did not burn out too soon. The warmth of the hearth was not simply convenient sit, was the heartbeat of the hall. And then there were these curious objects, made of metal pans with long handles, were filled with glowing embers from the fire. Servants would slip them between the layers of a noble's bed before they retired, moving them back and forth to chase away the chill of linen sheets. Of course, such contraptions had to be used carefully. The risk of fire was real, but in skilled hands, they transformed an icy bed into a place of comfort. The first moments of warmth, as a body sank into preheated sheets, must have felt like a gift in the bleakness of winter. Not all warmth came from fire or fabric. Food and drink, too, played their role in sleep. A warm meal before bed was a defense against the night, filling the body with energy to be slowly burned as one slept. Spiced wine, hot broth, or a mug of ale thick with grain might be taken before retiring. These simple comforts stoked the inner fire, making the hours under blankets more bearable. For some, herbs with calming or warming qualities were added: sage, thyme, or mint, blurring the line between medicine and sustenance. In smaller chambers, servants and guards often relied on sheer endurance. Woolen clothing was worn in layers, and furs scavenged from hunts were treasured not just for their beauty, but for their utility. Even scraps of animal hide could be fashioned into coverings. In such rooms, the cold was not defeated, but endured, made tolerable through habit, resilience, and a certain grim acceptance. Sleep in these conditions was not the peaceful surrender of modern life, but a negotiation between body and environment. And then there was companionship. In the medieval mindset, warmth was shared as much as it was generated. Servants might sleep at the foot of a lord's bed, not only as a sign of service, but also for mutual warmth. Children piled together, sisters or brothers curled like kittens beneath a single fur. Even travelers and strangers, brought in during storms, found themselves lying side by side on rush-strewn floors. To share warmth was to share survival. The intimacy of medieval sleep was a practical bond, erasing boundaries in the face of common necessity. Imagine, then, the sensory world of these sleepers. The roughness of woolen blankets against skin, the faint itch of straw beneath a mattress, the scent of smoke lingering in hair and clothing, the heavy silence punctuated by the crackle of fire, the distant howl of wind, the occasional stir of a restless dreamer turning under the weight of blankets. These nights were not quiet in the way we think of quiet, of the small sounds and sensations of bodies trying to remain warm within the cavernous spaces of stone. Thus, the medieval night was not conquered in one way alone, but in many small acts: the layering of clothes, the banking of fires, the clustering of families, the drawing of curtains, the slow acceptance of chill as part of life. Together, these methods wove a fragile shield against the cold, enough to carry each soul through the darkness into another dawn. As the medieval night stretched on, the castle settled into its rhythm of slumber. Torches sputtered in their brackets, sending little plumes of smoke curling upward to darkened rafters. Somewhere, a dog stirred, then fell quiet again. Guards walked their rounds upon the walls, stamping their feet against the biting wind. But within the keep, the sounds dwindled until only the faintest murmurs remained. Sleep had claimed the fortress, yet behind every closed eye and every layered blanket, though lavish by comparison to most, was still not immune to the creeping chill. Imagine lying beneath layers of wool and fur, the heavy curtains of the bed pulled tightly shut, shutting out the vastness of the room. A faint glow from the fire painted soft light across the fabric walls of the bedstead. Beyond them, the air would have been cold enough to sting the skin, but within a bubble of warmth slowly gathered, the shared body heat of sleepers, the trapped breath, the insulated fabrics all combined to create a private climate, one more forgiving than the stone world outside. For the medieval noble, this small island of comfort was as much an expression of wealth as any jeweled crown. But warmth was never constant. Fires burned low. Curtains did not seal perfectly. Drafts found their way through shutters, under doors, along floors. It was the job of servants to rise quietly in the night, to check the embers, to add a log, to sweep ash back over glowing coals so that they would last until morning. Such duties were often carried out by the youngest or lowest ranking attendants, who themselves might sleep curled upon a rush mat, wrapped in their cloaks, waiting for the call of duty. To them, warmth was fleeting, found only in moments near the hearth before returning to the chill of their humble bedding. In the great hall, where many more slept, warmth was shared in abundance, but also fleeting in nature. Bodies huddled near the great fire at the hall's center, the lucky ones closest to its glow, while others lay farther back, wrapped in cloaks, relying on one another for heat. The fire there was never allowed to die entirely. It was both symbol and survival, the light of the household and the protector of its people. The hall smelled of smoke, of sweat, of straw, of ale spilled earlier in the evening. Sleep here was not silent snores, rose and fell, voices muttered in dreams, and from time to time someone woke to shift, to stretch, to edge closer to the fire's warmth. Yet, in this communal chaos, there was a strange kind of safety, the comfort of knowing that one was not alone against the night, among the lesser folk of the castle. Conditions were harsher still. In storerooms, in barracks, in corners tucked away, servants and guards lay upon pallets of straw or old sacks filled with chaff. Blankets were thin, clothing worn, yet they endured. These were the people most accustomed to hardship, and the cold was simply another challenge of life. They knew to layer themselves in every garment they owned, to pull cloaks tight, to sleep close together when possible. A servant might share a pallet with another, not for affection, but for warmth. A guard might sleep with his boots still on, cloak wrapped about his shoulders, ready to rise at a moment's notice. Comfort was not the goal, survival was. But even here, small comforts were sought. Rushes strewn upon floors provided some insulation from the stone. Straw mattresses were replaced regularly to keep them somewhat fresh, and herbs such as lavender or rosemary were sometimes mixed into the rushes. Their scents, believed to ward off pestilence, but also giving a faint fragrance that softened the harshness of the environment. Such details remind us that even in austerity, people sought beauty and comfort where they could find it. Another subtle strategy against the cold was the use of layered bedding. Even those without great wealth understood the principle of trapping air between layers. A thin blanket beneath a heavier one was warmer than a single thick covering, as the air caught between them acted as insulation. Cloaks were often spread over beds, not removed, and furs, whether fox, rabbit, or even sheep pelts, were treasured possessions, pulled tight against shivering bodies. For some, animals themselves became part of the nightly warmth. In rural castles or outbuildings, it was not unusual for servants or lesser retainers to sleep in proximity to livestock. The body heat of animals, dogs, goats, even cattle provided natural warmth, and their presence was considered practical rather than shameful. In noble chambers, favored dogs often shared the bed with their masters, not merely as companions, but as living sources of heat. The phrase, "a three-dog night," meaning a night so cold that one needed 3 dogs to keep warm, may echo this ancient practice. The psychology of cold was also part of survival. People expected winter to be harsh, and expectations shaped endurance. To lie down upon a straw mattress in a drafty chamber, wrapped in rough wool, might seem unbearable to us today, but to them it was the rhythm of life. They were raised from childhood to accept the bite of winter, to understand that warmth was fleeting, that true comfort was rare. Endurance itself was a form of adaptation, and sleep, though sometimes restless, was still possible when the body and mind were trained to expect less. Some awoke briefly, as was common in segmented sleep. In these intervals, they might rise to stir the fire, to pray, to reflect, even to speak quietly with a bedfellow. This first sleep and second sleep divided the night, creating a pause that made the cold more bearable. In these waking moments, one might sip from a small flask of warmed ale or add another layer of blanket. The night was not one long stretch of suffering, it was a cycle of endurance, of adjustment, of small acts that together made survival possible. Think, for a moment, of the castle itself as it lay in darkness. From the outside, the towers were black silhouettes against the moonlit sky, their walls rimed with frost, their battlements dusted with snow. Inside, within those thick walls, people slept in clusters, wrapped in wool and fur, hidden within bed curtains, pressed close to embers. The stone was cold, but within the fabric, cocoons, and the glow of fires, pockets of warmth endured. Life continued, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat, until the morning bell would sound. So it was that medieval people slept, not easily, not in the comfort we know today, but with resilience born of necessity. Every layer of cloth, every shared body, every ember tended through the long night was an act of survival. And as they slept, whether noble in a curtained bed or servant on a straw pallet, they dreamed, not of warmth, perhaps, but of enduring until dawn, when the gray light would spill once again through narrow windows and the cycle of cold and life would begin anew. The medieval night was not the same everywhere. Castles dotted the landscapes of Europe, from the misty hills of Scotland to the forests of Germany, from the windswept plains of France to the snowy valleys of Scandinavia. Though all were built of stone and all carried with them the same enemy cold, how people faced the long nights varied with the climates, the cultures, and the resources of their homelands. To journey through these castles is to hear many variations of the same story, the story of survival against the chill, of ingenuity and endurance shaping the way people slept in the north. Where winters were long and merciless, strategies had to be most severe. Castles in Scotland or Scandinavia faced weeks of snow and ice, with winds that cut through cracks in stone and rattled shutters through the night. Here, fur was not luxury, but necessity. The hides of bear, deer, wolf, and sheep became bedding, cloaks, and coverings. Fireplaces were built wide and deep, with chimneys that drew fiercely to keep smoke from choking chambers. At night, fires were fed carefully, their coals banked to last until morning. Families slept in clusters, and attendants pressed themselves close to the warmth of their masters' chambers. In these places, the bed was as much a winter fortress as the castle itself, a sanctuary within a sanctuary. Farther south, in France, Spain, and Italy, the winters were less brutal but still cold enough to demand care. Here, the emphasis was not only on furs but also on fabric. Thick woolen blankets, woven in rich colors, layered upon one another to hold warmth. Bed curtains were crafted not just for function, but with beauty in mind, embroidered with patterns of leaves, vines, and sacred symbols. These southern chambers may not have faced the same biting cold as those in the north, yet the same practices, layering, clustering, tending fires still marked the rhythm of nightly survival. Regional foods, too, shaped the ways people prepared for sleep. In northern lands, hot broths made from root vegetables, grains, and salted meats filled bellies before bed, their warmth lingering through the night. In southern lands, mulled wine or spiced milk might be taken, flavored with cinnamon, nutmeg, or honey. These night meals were not feasts, but functional rituals, stoking the body's inner fire against the creeping chill. One can imagine the comfort of such a drink taken in the dim light of a chamber, the last sip before crawling into a bed curtained against the cold. But beyond region, social rank shaped sleep most of all. A lord or lady of wealth might sleep upon a feather mattress, layered with blankets, guarded by tapestries on the walls, and warmed by servants who kept the fire glowing. A servant, by contrast, might sleep on the rushes in the great hall, his bed nothing more than a cloak spread across straw, his warmth coming from the body of a fellow servant beside him. A guard on duty might catch only brief moments of rest, curled near the gatehouse fire, boots still on, hand never far from his weapon. In this way, the experience of cold was universal, but its solutions were deeply unequal. The cold itself did not distinguish between lord and servant, but wealth did. Still, wealth could not entirely shield one from the cold. Even the grandest chamber in the most fortified castle was vulnerable. Stone is merciless, it breathes cold, it drinks warmth. The higher the chamber, the more the wind pressed against its shutters. Curtains and furs slowed the chill, but they could not banish it. Records from the Middle Ages speak often of the long winter nights, of the hardship of sleeping through snowstorms that rattled doors and froze water inside. The noble may have had more layers, more servants, more firewood, but the cold seeped in regardless. It is in this shared struggle that we glimpse something timeless, the way cold humbles all people, reminding them of their fragility. A knight wrapped in fur, a servant wrapped in wool, they both breathed into the same winter air. They both curled tighter under their blankets. They both longed for dawn. In this, castles, for all their grandeur, were not so different from cottages and huts. All were human shelters against the same vast winter night. Let us linger for a moment on the atmosphere of such a night. The stone walls were thick, but sound carried strangely through them. From one chamber, a cough echoed. From another, the shifting of wooden beams as the firelight flickered. The smell of smoke and wool lingered everywhere, clinging to hair and skin, a reminder of the day's labors. Outside, the wind clawed at the battlements, snow hissed against shutters, owls called from the woods. The castle, though strong and silent, was alive with the quiet pulse of many bodies breathing, sleeping, and enduring together. Children, especially, were wrapped tightly, sometimes bound in swaddles, even past infancy. To ensure they did not kick free of blankets, they slept beside siblings, parents, or caretakers, their warmth guarded jealously. A noble child might have a cradle brought close to a hearth, its canopy draped in cloth to trap warmth. A peasant child, in the servants' quarters, might simply sleep in the crook of a mother's arm beneath a thin woolen covering. In both cases, survival was the same goal, and warmth was the same treasure. There were also rituals that surrounded the act of bedding down for the night. Some households prayed before retiring, asking for protection from the cold, from illness, and from evil spirits said to wander more freely in the long dark hours. Others told stories, their words filling the chamber with shared warmth of another kind, narratives that distracted from the cold, that lulled children to rest, that gave adults comfort in community. These stories, woven like blankets from imagination, may have been as essential as the furs themselves, for they wrapped the mind in safety even as the body shivered. And so, across Europe, castle dwellers faced the cold night in countless ways, through stone and fabric, through fire and food, through closeness and faith. No single method alone kept them alive. It was the layering of strategies, the layering of blankets, the layering of people, that together formed a shield against winter's cruelty. Sleep was not merely rest, it was survival, achieved through ingenuity, routine, and a quiet acceptance that life itself was always lived on the edge of endurance. Thus, as the night deepened in the medieval world, the castle became a vast patchwork of sleepers, some in silken beds with embroidered curtains, others on straw pallets by the dying glow of a fire. Yet all were joined in the same silent battle, all breathing into the cold air, all drifting into dreams wrapped in the fragile warmth they had managed to gather. The night in a medieval castle was never truly silent. While nobles rested behind their heavy curtains and children dreamed in the warmth of their mother's arms, the life of the household continued in slow, hushed rhythms. A castle was a community, and even in the stillness of the midnight hours, there were those who could not surrender fully to sleep. Servants, guards, cooks, and attendants lived in a world where duty stretched into the dark, and their relationship with warmth and rest was shaped as much by obligation as by survival. Servants were the silent guardians of warmth. Their tasks may have begun before the lord or lady retired, ensuring that the chamber fire was well fed, the bed preheated with embers in a warming pan, and blankets properly arranged. But the duty did not end once their master lay down. Many servants slept lightly, ready to rise if the fire dwindled too low, or if a draught forced its way in through shutters that rattled under the force of the wind. It was common for at least one attendant to remain nearby, either seated on a stool or curled at the foot of the bed, so that should the noble stir in the night, warmth could be restored without delay. For these attendants, warmth was uneven, a fleeting gift. They might feel the glow of the fire as they worked, but their own bedding was far more modest, a cloak on the rushes-strewn floor, a blanket that had seen many winters. The warmth of their master's chambers was never fully theirs, only borrowed in brief moments before being surrendered again. Yet their role was indispensable. Without their vigilance, the chamber might slip into darkness and cold, and the comfort of the bed curtains would not be enough to protect against the stone's unrelenting chill. Elsewhere in the castle, guards kept watch. On the battlements, men huddled in cloaks, stamping their boots against the frosted stone, their breath white in the night air. Theirs was a different battle against the cold, fought in shifts, fought against wind and snow, fought with torches and braziers that burned dimly along the walls. Some castles placed small fires in iron baskets, glowing beacons that guards clustered around in turns. Others simply trusted to wool and endurance, for firelight could betray a sentry's position. When their watch ended, these guards sought whatever warmth, or a pallet of straw in a corner where their bodies pressed close to fellow watchmen. Sleep for them was shallow, fleeting, often broken, but it was enough to carry them through until duty called again. The kitchens of the castle, too, bore witness to the night. Great ovens, once used to bake bread or roast meats, held onto their heat long after the fires had died. In these places, scullions and kitchen boys often sought refuge, curling near the warm stones for rest. The smell of baked loaves and smoke lingered, mingling with the faint warmth of embers trapped in the oven walls. For those at the bottom of the social ladder, the kitchens were both workplace and sanctuary, a rare corner where the cold was gentler. There was also belief woven into the night. Medieval people lived in a world where darkness was not only physical but spiritual. The night was thought to be a time when evil spirits, demons, and wandering souls were most active. To sleep was to make oneself vulnerable, and warmth was not only comfort but protection. Cold and darkness were linked in the mind to danger, illness, witchcraft, or even death itself. A fire left burning, a candle kept near the bed, or a prayer whispered before lying down was as much a shield against the unseen as against the frost. Illness, in particular, was closely tied to cold. It was believed that damp and chill could seep into the body, weakening it and inviting fevers or worse. To stay warm at night was not simply about comfort, but about preserving life. Parents worried over their children kicking free of blankets. The elderly were watched carefully to ensure their fires did not go out. The smallest chill was taken seriously, for it might be the start of something far graver. Thus, keeping warm was a duty of care, a nightly ritual bound up in both love and fear. Strange remedies and customs arose from these beliefs. Some households scattered herbs across bedding, not only for scent, but to ward off illness. Rosemary, lavender, and rue were thought to guard against the unseen dangers of the night. Warm stones, heated by the fire and wrapped in cloth, were placed at the foot of beds to warm frozen toes. It was said that keeping the stomach warm helped preserve health, so extra coverings were often draped across the midsection. Even charms or amulets were sometimes placed beneath pillows, mingling superstition with the fight against the cold. Children were perhaps the most carefully protected of all. In noble households, a nurse or governess ensured that the young ones were well bundled, that their fires were kept alive through the night, that they were shielded from drafts. In the homes of servants, mothers drew their little ones close, sharing their own body heat, wrapping them in whatever scraps of cloth or fur could be spared. The night, in its silence and cold, was a test of family bonds, for warmth was most often shared by touch an arm around a child, a body pressed close to a spouse, a dog curled at the foot of the bed. The castle shifted in and out of slumber. Somewhere the chapel bell might toll for the monastic hours, and monks or chaplains would rise from their beds to chant prayers in the dark, their breath clouding in the chill air of stone chapels. For them, sleep was broken by devotion, and their prayers rose not only for salvation, but perhaps also for warmth, for protection against the cold of body and soul. The echoes of their voices, solemn and low, drifted through corridors, a reminder that night was not simply for rest, but for vigilance, both earthly and spiritual. And so, the night in a medieval castle was a mosaic of experiences. A noble wrapped in furs within curtained bed, a servant curled on a rush mat, a guard stamping his feet upon the walls, a cook's boy sleeping by the dying glow of the oven, a mother holding her child beneath a rough woolen blanket. Each sought warmth in their own way, but all were bound by the same need, the same fragility, the same eternal struggle against the cold. When dawn at last approached, a pale light creeping through narrow windows, the night's endurance was felt in every limb. Fires were coaxed back to life, embers flared into new flames, and the castle stirred. Sleepers rose stiff and weary, pulling cloaks around their shoulders, ready to face another day of work, of duty, of survival. The cold was never gone, it lingered in walls and floors, in breath and bone, but with daylight came movement, and with movement came life. The long night had passed, and once again they had endured. As we move deeper into the heart of the medieval night, it becomes clear that sleep inside a castle was not simply a matter of lying down and drifting into dreams. It was a carefully managed ritual of survival. For within the grand stones and narrow corridors, the cold was relentless, and every hour of rest was won by effort, invention, and habit. Let us now step into the castle once more, this time following the hush of torches as they flicker low, listening to the slow settling of beams and stones as people drift into uneasy slumber high in the Lord's chambers. Warmth was more carefully guarded than in any other part of the keep. Yet even here, comfort was relative. The great canopy bed stood like a fortress within a fortress, hung with rich curtains of wool or velvet, heavy enough to block the constant draft that slipped through cracks in the walls and shutters. Inside this private cocoon, the air was warmer, softened by human breath and thick blankets of linen, wool, and fur. But even here, one could feel the cold pressing in, a quiet presence at the edges of sleep, waiting for the moment when the fire burned low. The fire itself, set in a grand hearth, was tended with diligence. A servant often lay on a pallet nearby, tasked with the responsibility of stoking the flames if they threatened to die. Wood was precious, carefully rationed, and never wasted. Ashes were banked to keep coals alive through the night, so that the fire might be revived with a few quick breaths at dawn. The scent of smoke clung to everything: clothes, tapestries. Harrowed though it could be overwhelming at times, it was also a kind of reassurance, the smell of survival, of warmth purchased against the cold. Meanwhile, in the great hall below, a different kind of sleep unfolded. Dozens of retainers, servants, and travelers lay scattered across the floor, bundled in cloaks, huddled against one another. The great fire roared less fiercely as the night deepened, leaving those farthest from the hearth to draw their cloaks tighter and shift closer together. In this communal world of slumber, warmth was a shared resource. Bodies pressed side by side, shoulders touching, breath mingling, all bound together in the simple need to keep cold at bay. Privacy dissolved in these conditions, but the comfort of companionship was its own shield against fear and frost. For those who slept near the walls, however, the night was harsher. The thick stone absorbed the day's chill and radiated it back into the room, making the edges of the hall bitterly cold. Here, straw mattresses were piled thicker, and cloaks were layered. Some clever folk propped small wooden screens around themselves, crude barriers that cut off the draft. Even a piece of cloth stretched across a bench or hung from a peg might make the difference between shivering all night and finding a few hours of peace. Children often bore the cold worst of all, and so they were swaddled in every available covering: old furs, woolen scraps, cloaks that had seen better days. Mothers tucked them against their own bodies, sharing warmth skin to skin. The fragile rhythm of sleep was broken often by crying, but the lull of the hall, the low murmur of voices, the snap of the fire soon carried them back into rest. For the young, sleep was a drifting, fragile thing, but the closeness of family created a warmth more enduring than even fire. In the smaller chambers of the garrison, where guards and soldiers rested, warmth was earned through endurance. The night watch demanded that men wake in shifts, patrolling the battlements, their cloaks stiff with frost, before returning to rest in crowded bunks. Here, straw mattresses were shared by two or more, and blankets were layered as thick as possible. Boots were left on, cloaks never fully shed, for the cold seeped even through stone walls. Some men carried small charms or tokens, pieces of fur, sprigs of herbs that they believed kept the chill at bay, blurring the line between practicality and superstition. Yet across all of these spaces, whether noble, chamber, or soldier's barracks, one practice was universal: layering. Clothing was not stripped away as we might today. Instead, people often slept in their undergarments, woolen tunics, or even full outfits, depending on the severity of the night. Linen, shifts, wool, stockings, and caps were all employed to keep heat from escaping. A simple woolen hat could mean the difference between a comfortable sleep and waking, shivering. And though furs were treasured for their luxury, even the roughest wool or patched garment became precious when the frost crept into one's bones. We might imagine the sensory world of such a night. The crackle of a log falling into embers, the sound of rustling straw as someone shifted under heavy blankets, the faint murmur of prayers whispered before sleep, asking for warmth, for dreams, for the grace of making it through the night. The air heavy with the mingled scents of smoke, sweat, wool, and the faint sweetness of herbs strewn on the floor. And always, always, the presence of the cold, like an unseen guest, waiting at the edges of every chamber. To live in a castle was to live in defiance of nature, and to sleep in one was to practice a nightly ritual of endurance. Every curtain drawn, every ember banked, every blanket layered, was a small act of resistance. And though the cold was never fully banished, it was softened into something bearable, something that could be endured until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the arrow slits, promising another day survived. The castle at night was not silent. Though its thick stone walls muted the wind and muffled distant sounds, life continued to stir, even as the torches dimmed. The great weight of darkness pressed in, but within its chambers people still whispered. Fires still glowed, and sleepers still shifted restlessly beneath their covers. For the medieval castle was not merely a place of defense, it was also a living, breathing world. And sleep within it was shaped by countless layers of tradition, superstition, and necessity. To understand how people managed to rest without freezing, one must first step into the rhythm of castle life. The cold was not a sudden enemy. It was a constant, expected presence, like hunger or fatigue. Those who lived within the walls grew accustomed to its persistence. They did not dream of warm, evenly heated rooms as we do today. Instead, they accepted the bite of winter air as natural and sought clever, layered methods to soften its touch in the Lord's chamber. The great bed stood as a centerpiece, not only of status, but of warmth. Beds were marvels of construction frames, carved of oak, hung with thick curtains, piled with mattresses, stuffed with straw, wool, or even feathers in rare cases. The layering was essential. First came a coarse under mattress of straw, which absorbed some of the chill of the floor. Upon it rested softer layers, sometimes stuffed with down, if wealth allowed, then linen sheets, woolen blankets, and finally, heavy furs drawn from the spoils of hunts. Bear, wolf, fox, or deerskin were transformed into shields against the cold. The bed batons, when drawn, created a pocket of warmth. Inside, the air quickly grew warmer from the breath of those sleeping within. This was no small detail. 4 beds were rarely occupied by only one person. A noble couple often shared their bed with attendants or children, while servants might sleep at the foot or in nearby pallets. Warmth was a communal act, and sharing space was not unusual but expected. Solitary sleeping, except for hermits or prisoners, was rare. The cold made sure of that. Meanwhile, down in the great hall, the night unfolded differently. Retainers, servants, and guests, without chambers of their own, made their beds where they could. The floor was strewn with rushes, herbs, and grasses scattered both to cover the stone and to freshen the air. Upon this makeshift bedding, people spread straw mats, cloaks, and blankets, lying shoulder to shoulder near the hearth. The fire here was the true master of the night. Its warmth reached those nearest, while the outer edges of the hall were left in shadow and chill. Those unlucky enough to sleep far from its glow often woke to frozen breath misting in the air, pulling their cloaks tighter and shifting closer when space allowed in small side chambers. Soldiers and guards tried to rest between shifts. They knew the rhythm of night watch, trudging across icy battlements, their cloaks stiff with frost, before returning to bunks or pallets to share warmth with comrades. Straw mattresses were communal, not private, and blankets were scarce. Men often slept in their clothes, even keeping boots on, ready to rise at a moment's notice. The smell of sweat, leather, and smoke lingered in these rooms, but to the weary, warmth mattered more than comfort. For women and children, the rituals of sleep carried their own traditions. Infants were swaddled tightly, wrapped in layer after layer of linen and wool, then placed close to their mothers' bodies, shielded by the warmth of family. Older children often slept together in small groups, their giggles fading into the night as exhaustion overcame them. Sisters and brothers curled beneath shared furs, whispering in the dark until the cold silenced their voices and sleep claimed them. In such intimacy, the bonds of kinship were strengthened each night, warmth woven together with affection. Yet beyond the physical measures, there were the rituals of the spirit. Before bed, many prayed for warmth and protection against the dangers of the night, not only the cold, but spirits, dreams, and unseen evils thought to wander in the darkness. Prayers were murmured, charms were hung near beds, and some believed that certain herbs, lavender, sage, or rosemary, could protect both body and soul during slumber. These herbs, scattered among the rushes, released faint scents that mingled with smoke and wool, adding a subtle layer of comfort to the sensory world of the sleeper. We must not forget the humble tools of survival, such as the bed-warmer brass or copper pan filled with glowing embers, slipped between the sheets to chase away the chill. Servants wielded these carefully, for fire was both friend and danger in a castle. A moment of carelessness could turn warmth into catastrophe. But when done properly, the bed was transformed from a frozen slab into a haven, waiting for weary bodies to sink into. And then there was food. Warm meals before bed were as essential as blankets. A bowl of thick pottage, a cup of mulled wine, or a tankard of warm ale carried heat into the body, spreading it through the limbs and making the cold easier to endure. These nightly rituals of nourishment were as important to survival as the fire itself, for an empty stomach made the cold more bitter. Imagine, then, the sounds and sensations of a winter's night in a castle, the crackle of fire, the muffled breathing of sleepers, the rustle of straw, the occasional cry of an infant quickly hushed, the low voice of a guard murmuring a prayer as he passed through the hall. Outside, the wind howled across battlements, rattling shutters and whistling through arrow slits. Yet within the stone walls, life persisted, bodies huddled together, fires glowing faintly. Warmth clung too stubbornly against the vast cold. The medieval night was not conquered but endured. Each soul who slept within the castle walls knew the cold as a constant companion. Yet by layering clothes, by banking fires, by sharing warmth, and by weaving together rituals, both practical and spiritual, they created a fragile shield strong enough to carry them through until dawn, when the first pale light filtered through shutters and arrow slits. When fires were stirred anew, and warmth returned to the halls, there was always a quiet triumph. Another night had been survived. Another dawn had been reached. And in that fragile victory, life continued, one breath at a time. Night after night, winter after winter, the cold never truly released its grip on those who lived within the stone walls of medieval castles. It was not an occasional visitor, but a constant presence, slipping under doors, seeping through shutters, creeping into the very stones themselves. And so, each night's rest became a small battle fought with fabric, fire, companionship. To fall asleep was not only to surrender to dreams, but also to trust that the measures taken would be enough to keep life within the body until the light of dawn returned. For the nobility, whose wealth afforded them more comforts, the rituals of sleep were elaborate. Their bedchambers were chosen carefully, often tucked into inner rooms rather than those that pressed against the outer walls of the keep. Stone walls that faced the bitter winds were poor companions for rest, so thick tapestries were hung to soften both sound and chill. These woven hangings, adorned with images of saints, battles, or family crests, were not simply decorations, they were practical shields, keeping the warmth of fire and body from bleeding away into the stone. The hearth in a noble's chamber was never left untended. Servants, often boys or young attendants, curled on pallets close by, rising when the flames faltered, stirring embers back to life, adding wood in careful measure. The fire glowed through the night, its crackle a kind of heartbeat within the chamber. Even so, the warmth spread unevenly. Those closest to the hearth basked in its glow, while the outer reaches of the room remained shrouded in icy shadow. The bed itself was a fortress against this cold, with curtains drawn tightly to hold in every bit of heat. The bedding was a marvel of layers. Beneath the sleepers lay a mattress stuffed with straw, then perhaps another filled with feathers, if the household was wealthy enough. Linen sheets came next, smooth and cool, followed by heavy woolen blankets, and finally furs drawn from hunts fox, deer, or even bear, their weight pressing down like a shield against frost. To slip into such a bed was to enter a carefully constructed cocoon, one designed to turn the inhospitable stone chamber into a private pocket of warmth. But even these luxuries could not always drive away the bite of winter. Bed warmers, those curious brass or copper pans filled with hot embers, were carried by servants and swept across the sheets before their masters retired. The hiss of heated metal against linen, the faint scorch of fabric too closely touched, the sudden bloom of warmth spreading beneath the covers, these were the small miracles of survival. For those first moments of contact between body and pre-warmed bed, the cold seemed to vanish, replaced by a wave of comfort that made sleep possible. Down in the great hall, life unfolded differently. The fire here was the center of all things, its flames illuminating the long tables and rushes-strewn floor where dozens prepared to sleep. Cloaks became blankets, straw mats became mattresses, and warmth was shared freely. Retainers, servants, travelers, and sometimes even strangers lay side by side, their breath mingling in the smoky air. Privacy was not considered, for survival demanded closeness. The fire roared at first, but as wood dwindled, it burned lower, leaving the farthest edges of the hall to grow bitterly cold. Those who slept near the walls curled tighter, drawing cloaks close, while those nearer the fire shifted outward to make room for others. The rushes underfoot played their part, too, mixed with dried herbs like lavender, rosemary, or thyme. They offered a faint fragrance that softened the harsher smells of smoke, sweat, and animals. These herbs, believed to protect against both illness and spirits, became companions to sleep. Imagine lying upon straw and rushes, the faint prickle softened by layers of cloth, the scent of rosemary drifting faintly upward as the fire crackled nearby. For the weary body, such humble comforts were treasures in the soldiers' quarters. Warmth was found less in comfort and more in necessity. Guards returned from night watch with frost stiffening their cloaks, cheeks raw from the wind. They stripped off little, choosing instead to sleep in tunics and boots, weapons close at hand. Straw beds were shared by 2 or 3 men, their bodies pressed together for warmth. Conversation drifted into silence as exhaustion claimed them, the rhythm of their breathing blending with the ever-present sigh of the wind outside. Their sleep was never deep shift of the watch pulled. Someone from rest, but it was enough to restore strength for the coming day. Children, perhaps more than anyone, needed the protection of layers. Mothers swaddled infants tightly, wrapping them in wool and linen until they resembled small bundles of fabric, then pulled them close beneath furs. Older children nestled together, whispering stories in the dark, their warmth shared through proximity. It was not uncommon for entire families to share a single bed, not out of poverty alone, but out of wisdom. The body heat of many was the surest safeguard against the night. And then there were the sounds of sleep in such a place. The creak of wood settling in the fire, the occasional cough or murmur from a restless sleeper, the muffled footsteps of a servant tending coals, the soft whisper of wind pushing at shutters and arrow slits, the faint rustle of straw as someone turned under their cloak. These were the lullabies of the medieval castle Lurthy, human and constant. Yet, for all the hardships, there was a kind of beauty in the way people adapted. Cold was not the enemy of one person, but of all, and so warmth became communal. Fires were shared, blankets were layered, beds were crowded, and in that closeness, bonds of family, duty, and companionship were deepened. A servant tending the hearth was not merely performing duty, but safeguarding the life of the household. A mother, swaddling her child, was not only nurturing, but ensuring survival. Even the act of lying down side by side with strangers became a silent agreement to share warmth, to trust one another against the cold. Thus, in the medieval night, people did not conquer the cold, they endured it, resisted it, and learned to bend it into something survivable. The castle, with its high walls and endless corridors of stone, was not built for comfort. Yet, within its chambers, people built small worlds of warmth, beds curtained and piled high, hearths carefully tended, straw laid thick upon the floor, herbs scattered for comfort, and bodies gathered close. Each measure alone was not enough, but together they created a fragile, enduring shield. And so the night passed, hour by hour, the cold pressing always at the edges, but never quite breaking through, until, at last, the first gray light crept through narrow slits in the walls, and the fires were stirred anew. Dawn meant not only another day of duties, hunts, prayers, and labor, but also a quiet victory, the triumph of warmth and life over the vast, unyielding cold of the medieval night. By the time the castle had settled into its deepest silence, when fires burned low and most souls lay wrapped in slumber, the true test of medieval sleep began. For in those long, dark hours before dawn, when embers dwindled and the bitter cold crept ever deeper into stone and bone, every layer of protection mattered. The medieval world did not know central heating, yet somehow, night after night, they endured. The architecture of the castle itself played a role in this endurance. Though stone walls trapped cold, their sheer thickness also slowed its bite. Inner chambers, far from outer walls, often held a more stable temperature than drafty rooms near battlements or towers. Narrow windows, built for defense, let in little more than slivers of moonlight and gusts of wind when their shutters did not fully hold. It was a world of shadows, of shifting torchlight, of breath rising in faint clouds, even indoors. And yet, within these seemingly inhospitable walls, people learned to create islands of warmth. For the nobility, their bedchambers were carefully chosen sanctuaries. Beyond tapestries and heavy curtains, furniture itself was arranged with purpose. Chests were pulled close to walls to block drafts. Benches were placed near hearths where servants might rest between tending the fire. The bed dominated the chamber, not merely as a place to sleep, but as the very heart of survival. With its layered mattresses, sheets, blankets, and furs, it became a fortress within a fortress, a cocoon against the cold stone of the keep. The ritual of preparing for bed was itself a defense against freezing. Servants entered first, checking shutters, stoking the hearth, sweeping fresh rushes across the floor, scattering herbs whose scent and symbolism brought both comfort and protection. Bed warmers, filled with glowing embers, were run carefully over the sheets, leaving behind a trace of heat and the faint smell of smoke. Only when the chamber was ready did the lord or lady retire, often accompanied by attendants who shared their space, their presence serving as both warmth and security. Yet even the greatest of lords could not command the night to be kind. The cold pressed at every seam of the chamber, reminding them that wealth softened but never fully banished winter. And so, families drew closer together. Children were sometimes brought into their parents' bed on the coldest nights, their small bodies adding to the pool of shared warmth. Servants might sleep at the foot of the bed or on pallets nearby, ready to rise at the call of their masters, but also sharing in the collective body heat that turned icy rooms into bearable sanctuaries in the great hall. The rhythms of sleep were more chaotic, but no less vital. Dozens of retainers, servants, and travelers slept in close company, sprawled across the rushes and straw. The air was thick with the mingled scent of wood smoke, sweat, wool, and herbs. The fire glowed dimly, sending shifting shadows across the beams above. Conversation dwindled into silence, then into the soft chorus of breathing, snoring, coughing, and the occasional murmur of a dreamer. Here, warmth was shared without question. A cloak was pulled over, two instead of one, a blanket stretched across a group of weary bodies. The cold did not respect rank, and so even strangers might huddle close, their survival woven together in the quiet intimacy of necessity. The garrison barracks were harsher still. Soldiers accustomed themselves to endurance, wrapping themselves in cloaks, sleeping in boots, never far from weapons. Their beds were often nothing more than straw pallets packed into corners, with 2 or 3 sharing space for warmth. The camaraderie of soldiers extended even into slumber comradeship, forged not just in battle but in the long nights when frost threatened to seep into every bone. Their sleep was light, broken by the rhythm of watch shifts, the tread of boots across stone, the low murmur of voices keeping one another awake on patrol. Children's sleep, too, told its own story. Swaddled tightly in wool and linen, infants slept against their mothers' bodies, lulled by warmth and heartbeat. Older children nestled together in shared beds or on pallets, whispering stories until fatigue silenced them. Their dreams unfolded beneath heavy furs. Their small forms curled instinctively toward one another. Warmth gathered in closeness. In these intimate clusters, survival was taught not through words but through nightly practice, an unspoken lesson that warmth was communal, that life endured only when shared. Food and drink, prepared before retiring, offered a final layer of defense. A bowl of thick stew, a tankard of ale, or spiced wine carried heat into the body, providing fuel to sustain it through the night. In some households, warm milk infused with herbs was given to children, both to ease their sleep and to strengthen them against the cold. These simple measures, combined with prayer and ritual, created a fragile shield that carried families from dusk to dawn, and through it all, the sounds of night wrapped around the sleepers. The pop of a log collapsing in the hearth, the sigh of wind pushing at shutters, the rustle of straw as someone shifted restlessly, the faint jingling of chainmail or weapon belts in the garrison, the occasional cry of a child quickly soothed. These sounds, ordinary and persistent, were the lullabies of the medieval castle, reminders that even in the darkest hours, life continued. The cold was never fully defeated. It pressed always at the edge of sleep, lingering in the air, biting at fingers and toes, reminding every soul that survival was a nightly triumph. And yet, through layers of fabric, through the careful tending of fires, through the sharing of warmth in families and communities, they endured. In their endurance lay a quiet resilience, a testament to the human spirit's ability to adapt, to turn even the harshest of nights into survivable rest. When dawn finally returned, when the first light crept through arrow slits and shutters, when fires were stoked once more and the chill of night began to retreat, was not merely the beginning of a new day. It was a victory, a fragile but powerful triumph of warmth, faith, and fellowship over the unyielding cold of the medieval night. The medieval night was more than darkness. It was a test, a weight, an unrelenting presence. Within the thick walls of stone castles, sleep was never as simple as laying down one's head. It was survival, ritual, and endurance bound together. Every ember banked, every cloak pulled close, every whispered prayer at bedside was part of a nightly battle against the cold. And yet, across centuries, through the long winters of Europe, people found ways to endure. When we picture a castle, we often see strength, towering walls, battlements, iron gates, but in truth, the greatest struggle within those walls was not always against armies or invaders. It was against the chill of winter nights. Cold was a constant intruder, slipping silently through shutters, pressing against tapestries, radiating from the stones themselves. The people of the medieval world could not banish it, but they learned to bend it, to soften its bite with ingenuity and resilience. The nobility slept in their great beds, fortresses of wood and fabric, layered with linen, wool, and furs. Curtains were drawn tight, fires carefully tended, servants ever near to stoke the hearth or warm the sheets with glowing embers. These rituals of comfort were as much necessity as luxury, for even the wealthiest lord or lady could not command the winter to be kind. Instead, they created islands of warmth within a sea of cold. Small worlds of survival hidden behind drawn curtains. In the great halls, life unfolded in a more communal rhythm. Dozens of bodies lay close together, cloaks draped and straw beds spread across the rushes. The warmth of one became the warmth of many. The fire, glowing at the hall's center, was the heart of the night. Those closest basked in its heat, while those at the edges drew tighter into themselves, shifting slowly inward as embers dimmed. Privacy dissolved, but survival was ensured. The simple act of huddling side by side transformed the vast, drafty hall into a place of shared endurance. The garrison, too, knew the same patterns. Soldiers returned from the icy battlements, cloaks stiff with frost, and collapsed into bunks or straw pallets, often without removing boots or tunics. They shared warmth with comrades, their weapons always within reach. Their sleep was not deep broken by the rhythm of the watch, but it was enough. In this cycle of duty and rest, they found a strange companionship, forged as much in frozen nights as in the fires of battle. Children learned these lessons of survival early, swaddled tightly, laid beside mothers. Clustered with siblings beneath shared furs, they grew up knowing that warmth was a gift, one created and preserved together. Their laughter in the evenings, their whispers before sleep, softened the harshness of the night, turning necessity into intimacy. Each morning they woke alive was a quiet triumph of care and closeness. And so, night after night, the people of medieval castles endured. They endured with blankets and bed curtains, with straw and herbs, with fire and shared breath. They endured through superstition and prayer, through clever invention and sheer endurance. The cold could not be banished, but it could be survived, and survival became its own quiet kind of victory. Now imagine, for a moment, drifting into their world. You lie in a stone chamber, the fire crackling faintly, smoke curling lazily toward the rafters. Heavy curtains surround you, muffling the drafts. Beneath you are layers of straw, wool, and fur, pressing their weight into your body. Around you, the sounds of others breathing, shifting, murmuring in their dreams. Outside, the wind howls across the battlements, but here, within these walls, there is warmth, fragile, imperfect, but enough. The night stretches long, the hours passing slowly, and yet dawn always comes. The first pale light slips through the narrow windows, turning shadows to gray. Fires are stirred again. Servants rise to sweep rushes and stoke coals. Soldiers rouse themselves for another day of duty. Children stir, yawning beneath shared blankets. Mothers pull them close for a final moment of warmth before the day begins. The cold has not left, but it has been endured. This was the rhythm of medieval life, harsh, unyielding, but survivable. A rhythm built not on comfort, but on resilience. Not on ease, but on endurance. And though centuries have passed, The memory lingers in the stones of those castles, in the walls that once held voices, prayers, and the long sighs of sleepers wrapped against the cold. So, the question of how they survived is answered not with a single trick, but with a tapestry of methods: furs, fires, curtains, closeness, prayer. They did not conquer the night, they endured it, and in that endurance, in that nightly triumph of warmth over frost, lies the quiet story of medieval sleep. The castles stand still, their stones silent, their chambers empty. But if you listen closely, perhaps you can still hear it: the faint crackle of fire, the soft murmur of breath, the rustle of strand. Know that once, long ago, people dreamed here, and lived, and endured the endless cold of the medieval night.